Hey there, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our True Talk Thursday vodcast. Tonight, we have the honor and privilege of featuring a dynamic panel of leaders that will be kicking off our series discussion around assessments. Now more than ever, assessments are considered a trigger word, but we need them to truly understand how to mitigate learning loss since we've pivoted to virtual learning. You'll have the great fortune of hearing our panelists discuss the importance of those assessments, the need for them to be tailored through an equitable lens, and the ways in which we're utilizing them to meet the needs of our students during these unprecedented times. Driving the conversation around the topic, we have Dr. Maria Armstrong, who is the Executive Director of ALAS, and co-facilitating that conversation alongside her, we have Dr. Atiba Weza, who is the Executive Director for NASB. All right, Maria and Atiba, take it away.
Welcome and good evening, everyone. The purpose of our ALAS Zoomcast, podcast, I don't know, we've gone through so many iterations of this, right, Atiba, that we're here. That's the bottom line, is we're here. And it's to provide a venue or medium to encourage and engage in a conversation about topics that center around education. But we have to preface that what we talk about are our own opinions and not necessarily that of ALAS or NABSI. Therefore, my name, as Francois mentioned, is Maria Armstrong, and I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Association of Latino Administrators and Superintendents. And my co-host, Atiba Weza, is the Executive Director as well for NABSI. And I'd like to begin tonight, as Francois mentioned, we're going to be talking about assessments. And I'd like to start out by having our panel just spend a quick minute introducing yourself, and then we'll get started on some really juicy questions. So, my Hollywood Squares or Brady Bunch, whatever generation you're in, it looks like we want to start with Dr. Wesley Smith.
Hi, everyone. Wes Smith. I am the Executive Director of the Association of California School Administrators. We serve about 18,000 leaders who are prioritizing the rights and needs of 6.3 million students in California. Before that, I was a teacher, a principal, and a superintendent. So it's an honor to be here. Very, very strong supporter of the folks on this call. And the work that you all do at the national level. So thank you.
Thank you. Elda.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Elda Garcia, and I am the Executive Director for the National Association of Testing Professionals. And we're a brand new organization designed to kind of assist the boots on the ground, the district and campus coordinators that are making the magic happen on the front end. And prior to that, I'm actually a district testing coordinator for almost 20 years in a large school district and in Texas. And then I also served as the president of the largest assessment network in Texas, which is the TSNAP group. They serve over 1,100 members. I served as the president last year, and I'm currently serving as the immediate past president. So incredible opportunities there for network and collaboration, and really inspired me to really lift this to the national level and support as many as we can.
Awesome. Good to have you here. Pete.
Well, good evening, everybody. Pete Gonzalez, Vice President of U.S. School Districts in the western part of the United States. I have the great pleasure of overseeing folks that work with your school districts across the western states. And NWA is a world leader in assessment. We assess over 11 million students, both in the U.S. and across the world in 140 countries. Glad to be here today, and thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for joining us, Pete. Laura.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm the Director of Standards and Accountability on the K-12 Education Policy Team at the Center for American Progress. And prior to that, I worked at the U.S. Department of Education in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Ed, where I carried out a lot of the work related to Title I, so standards, assessment, accountability, school improvement grants, the No Child Left Behind waivers. So testing and accountability is what I've been focused on professionally for about the last decade or so. So this conversation is right up my alley.
We're so glad to have you. And, you know, one of the things that we do on True Talk Thursdays is we don't really necessarily need to wait until asked to join in on the conversation. Just jump in when you want, okay? So I'm not going to pose a question directly to somebody, neither is Atiba. We're just going to throw it out there and let's see where it takes us. Let's have some fun, folks. Atiba, do you want to ask that first question?
Yes, indeed. I'm in New York State, and for the last maybe 10, 15 years, the issue of testing and assessment has been a great vexing point, if you will. The wealthy districts have opted out of the standards tests. The poor districts don't have the resources. And every year, it's a big fight between the superintendents, members of the Board of Regents, members of the commissioners, cabinet, and so forth. Why? First, is assessment that important? A, and if so, why the big fight? Anyone?
Sure. So the big fight is because we have conflated accountability with punishment. They are not the same thing. And frankly, the tests that have been used in accountability systems for the last 20 years are primarily a policy tool. They were never intended to be an instructional tool. But I do believe this latest generation of assessments were sold that way. And I was part of the group that did the selling. So, you know, guilty. They are certainly an advancement, but they don't provide sufficiently detailed information like really high quality formative and interim assessments do that help teachers guide their practice. But at the same time, these tests, they do have an impact to schools in terms of what happens on the ground as a result of them. So I think because of the design of the tests and how the tests have been used, and frankly, their lack of usefulness in the classroom, they certainly have gotten this reputation as being just a punitive measure. But at the same time, you know, we can't put all of that on just that one assessment. We don't have effective holistic assessment practices in the United States. There might be some islands of excellence, and some folks here on the call might be able to point to some, but as a nation, we don't have a holistic system of learning connected to assessments, connected to outcomes. So I'll let others weigh in, but that's my answer to that question.
Yeah, Laura, I like that, Laura. I think that is much of kind of what is the vibe, I think, across the board, right? I mean, assessment is really just a trigger word to get to the topic, is because it's tied to accountability. And I know that's a later question, but that's a big issue, is that it is tied to accountability and all the high stakes involved and has its implications therein. So, I mean, and with that also, it invites, you know, the conversation that has been longstanding about inequity. And that's, you know, what we will absolutely have an opportunity to flesh out a little bit here today. But, and then the fact that kids are just struggling with it. So to your point, Lada, I think that's really just an issue of the assessment itself, and really kind of trying to promote the conversation about getting good quality assessments that serve the purpose that they're intended to serve. Because I think that's, you know, the kind of part of the point here is that we're forcing assessments to do far more than they were intended to do. You know, they were supposed to kind of guide instruction, tell us more about how much students are learning. Are they growing? Are they grasping the concepts? Are they able to apply the skills? Those very basic questions that we're supposed to be using them for. But we've not done that. We've actually stepped far beyond that to try to use them for far more than that purpose. We use them to rank schools. We use them to determine promotion for students. We evaluate teachers with them. I mean, there's all sorts of things. We stuff them into very complicated formulas for accountability. And so I really think that there's a lot to kind of be said there about two different things. And we'll get to that on the other question about assessment and accountability as a combined topic and separation, because I think that's part of the problem, is that they are coupled and they shouldn't be. They need to be decoupled. We need to kind of re-examine how we look at each to serve their individual purposes and not complicated by convoluting the process.
So Elda, you know, to add to that wonderful statement is that we often, when we think about this type of assessment, we forget about the child, the impact of assessment on the child. You know, it's one thing to assess the child, but then are we causing the right impact on the child that they're engaging in their learning? You know, they're excited about learning. They see the assessment has a purpose. And the other piece is the impact on the families, you know, because they have to support those children at home. And are the parents also engaged? Is the assessment providing an opportunity for the parent to engage in their child's learning, or that family to engage in that child's learning? If we miss the child, then we kind of wonder, that's why, you know, it's such a trigger. We see people and families, students and families being impacted negatively. And as a result, then it adds a negative connotation to the whole holistic view of assessment, because assessment for learning is a wonderful thing, because it is keeping the child in mind, and it does provide in-home supports for the child's continued learning at home.
Yeah, everyone's hitting on this. The most important pedagogical question is why? Why are we doing this? And if it's of and for learning, then we're all in. But I think Laura hit it on the head. It's a political metric, not a learning metric. And so that's why it's been hit with such resistance. You ask teachers how they can use this data, and they'll tell you not at all at the state level. Most states didn't even invest in the formative assessments, the benchmarks along the way. So they say they're about progress monitoring, but they don't have any metric for monitoring progress. It isn't true. I would say this too, and it was mentioned briefly. Part of the problem with the pushback now on assessments is in NCLB, it was tied to teacher evaluations. The big push was to have value add evaluations across the nation. And so you saw labor groups all over this country saying absolutely not. And they spent so much money and time fighting against that now the mere mention of testing takes them back to this trauma that they experienced during NCLB. And so we've got to, unlearn that trauma. We've got to grow trust, and we've got to decide that we're assessing for the right why. And I fear that doesn't happen often enough, and it certainly doesn't happen with politicians.
But I think part of the thing that we're all saying but haven't said directly is that assessments have to be tied to what students are learning, which is the curriculum. And we know that that's not the case in many, many schools. The assessments are not connected to the curriculum, to the scope and sequence. And so you have students learning one thing and being assessed on another, and then we wonder why their outcomes aren't where we want them to be. And it's because we're not assessing them on what they're actually learning. So we're kind of putting the cart before the horse in this conversation. We really need to be talking about what is the quality of the curriculum that students have, and are teachers masters of that curriculum and their connection to the standards? And then do we have assessments then that kind of connect all of that together, right? Like we're all saying it has to be holistic, because right now it's completely disconnected and it's sending very different signals about how students are doing. So we don't really have very many accurate pictures of how they're doing.
Yeah, I'll add just to close out this topic, I'll add to that, Laura, because I think that is an excellent point, and one that kind of really kind of stays with me, because we get caught up on the accountability results of things, and we see the disparity. We see the disparity of the performance between, racial minorities, low socioeconomic students, our special ed kids, our ELL kids. The disparity exists, and that is true of the data, but it's not new. It's the same conversation we've been having for decades. And so we have to ask ourselves, why are we still asking the same questions about that disparity in performance? And it really does get to your point, Laura, about saying, is the assessment accurately reflecting what we're instructing? Is there a good kind of relationship there? Was it designed? Is it aligned? And ask ourselves to dig a little deeper in regards to instruction, because until we address the issue of inequity or disparity in the instructional space, the accountability part will never be corrected.
So if I'm listening, to all of this correctly, there's an agreement, of course, across the board about, why it's a trigger word. From a historical standpoint, Like Wes said, it brings up this trauma when it was introduced the way it was introduced. But then I got to think about if we are looking for results, if there is a point to be able to say, hey, kids need to learn this by XYZ grade. If we know that as a nation, that this is what they're supposed to learn, then to, I think, Laura's point and Alda's, that we have to then take a look at that and step back. If we're results oriented, then shouldn't we be designing that curriculum to give us that outcome? I don't know, but maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more, right? In another question. So here's another question for you. If we're thinking about results-oriented outcomes and assessments that differ and are used for many different things, I should say, then when it comes to equity, how should we be using that equity lens when we think about assessments? Because equity means a whole lot of different things to different people, just like assessments, right? Elda?
Yep, I'll take a stab at that. I think that when we use the equity lens, we've got to do it very intentionally in order to make good decisions for students, the best decisions possible for kids. We need to recognize the disparity that we've already kind of discussed that is very apparent in the data, and recognize that it is a longstanding problem, that we acknowledge that, and we have to make sure that we understand maybe some of those things that are contributing to that process so that we can really kind of get at the heart of the matter. I think it gets very complicated very quickly when you start to work it into accountability. And I think that we're going to need to strike a balance with things, because I think some good things have happened with the accountability system. And there's challenges because the accountability system varies from state to state also, with some federal mandates regulating the whole thing, right? But in Texas, for example, there were some positive changes with the introduction of the ESSA components into the accountability system, forcing us to ensure quality instruction for all of our subpopulations. We're looking very closely at the ELL kids, the special ed kids, all the racial minorities, all of those issues that historically have shown equity challenges and requiring some action when that disparity exists. So I think that there are some good intentions behind the accountability system. It's just not quite right because of the assessment not being designed to do all that we're forcing it to do. And also the pressure that kind of surrounds it. Because as a result, you tie accountability, and now you have, you kind of deviated from your original focus by applying that high stakes standard. Now people are stressed out about it. Now they're, it's really kind of taking on a different meaning. They start to teach to the test. I mean, all sorts of things that come associated with that. So all that to be said is that I think we need to keep that equity lens on and very intentional so that we can keep sight of all the progress that we've made to date, even prior to COVID, because this has been a long kind of standing problem and issue, and people have been working very hard to get to the point of making progress, to having meaningful conversation around that and recommending actionable solutions. So I think that we need to not lose focus of that so we don't lose momentum. And then to that, we're going to have to add, what we've learned from COVID, because we know, that now those disparities, are now even exacerbated because of the complications and the challenges of COVID. So I'm just saying we need to kind of keep focus on all the progress and advocacy efforts that we've made, apply what we've learned from COVID so that we can keep the conversation advancing.
But I think also we have to, in that equity lens, understand who our customers are. The children come from various backgrounds and societies and communities, and they have different languages. So the assessment needs to be careful that it has a very good intentionality and bias and sensitivity. That questions in the assessment do not result in the child being served differently than their peers because the assessment was not built with an equitable lens. An assessment, of course, we serve, ALAS members serve many students across the country, that began their educational careers in public schools speaking Spanish only. Okay, so the assessment also has to serve those students, okay, with authentic assessment, so that when they're being assessed for the content that Laura speaks about, it is measuring and assessing the student in the content for which they're receiving instruction. Okay, not just they have to, first of all, take an English test, okay, but then not just a translated English test, okay, because that doesn't serve the student at all. So it's just kind of getting very specific into the content of the assessment, has to have that equitable lens to make sure that if we're going to make decisions for the students' instruction and educational career, that it is providing just as much equitable balance between English-speaking students, Spanish-speaking students, students that come from different parts of our communities. They may not be exposed to things that a question the student may just guess at, and then actually we're making an instructional decision that's not equitable.
Yeah, Laura mentioned this earlier, but we talk about this equity lens. I mean, it starts with what are the standards? What are we trying to teach? And do we have equitable access to high quality, rigorous, viable standards? Do we have access to high quality instruction? And the data nationally says we don't, that our neediest students rarely get the most effective teachers. And then the way we administer these metrics have to be done equitably also. It is, to me, reprehensible that in California, you can, if you are in Palo Alto, take the test in front of a computer, on a computer, pre-COVID, and in East Palo Alto, right across the 101, you can do it paper pencil. How is that a system that is fair and equitable for students, especially the underserved students in those communities? And I think this too, the word accountability, I was really, really glad, Elda, that you brought this up, because I think we have to lean into accountability. We can't pretend like it's a bad word. Michael Fullen and all of his books, it seems like he's writing a book a week. But back in the day before coherence, he would say, well, he and Andy Hargraves, accountability is a bad word. We don't need accountability. And I'm like, yes, we do. As a father, man, I'm accountable for what I do as a parent, right? As a husband, I'm accountable for how I treat my family, how I treat my wife. I'm accountable for the resources I have in my home to provide safety for my family. And you better believe that if you're given public resources to protect the rights and needs of students, you are accountable for each and every one of those precious resources you're given. Accountability is not a negative word, right? Accountability, responsibility, we need to lean in to that. And I think, again, it goes back to, this issue of trauma, what happened in the past. We got to move past that and lean in to accountability.
I'm so glad you said that, Wes, because as you guys are talking about this, and somebody mentioned NCLB and moving past the trauma. Well, I don't know, maybe Atiba, maybe Wes is right around the same generation that I am, and we used to have to take the Regents test, national tests, right? And that Regents test was to get a snapshot of how well kids were faring in their education. It wasn't the be-all, end-all to inform instruction. And so it sounds like we've kind of snowballed over time and looking for that magic bullet to encompass everything. And like you say, now we've even thrown in the fact that accountable from all various facets in this huge snowball that we don't even know how to dissect and have that common language, let alone common understanding of what assessments and accountability really are. And so with that, we're going to hold off and we're going to come back and continue the conversation. So come back and talk to us in a little bit.
Hey there, and don't forget, if you like what you hear and want to gain some more insight into what school districts are facing now, then tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m. or subscribe below. We thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great night.